A very good evening to everyone far and near. Welcome to the Sir John Monash Lecture Series 2 for 2021. I'm your host, Muhammad Ismail, and before we proceed further, please allow me to highlight a few housekeeping rules pertaining to the lecture. The lecture is recorded. The lecture will be for 1 hour, after which we will proceed with a question and answer session for about 30 minutes. You are under the listen and view only mode. Therefore, please type your questions in the provided Q&A box for the speaker to answer, which will be moderated by Associate Professor Muhammad Farooq Sheikh. And last but not least, please complete the feedback form, which will be placed in the chat box before and after the lecture. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I would like to invite Associate Professor Dr. Muhammad Farooq Sheikh from the Jeffrey Chia School of Medicine and Health Sciences, Monash University, Malaysia, to introduce our distinguished speaker and moderate the lecture for this evening. Professor Farooq.
Thank you so much, Ismail. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second Sir John Monash Distinguished Public Lecture Series for the year 2021. As you guys know, that Sir John Monash Public Lecture Series provides Monash University, Malaysia with an opportunity to engage the community in Malaysia and the region and throughout the world through the promotion of thought leadership in key areas that are strategic to the development of region in the 21st century. This particular lecture series takes inspiration from Sir John Monash, who is considered to be one of the Australia's most distinguished citizen, scholar, leader, and a man who sought to use his education and abilities for the benefit of the community. The public lecture series covers a wide variety of contemporary and interdisciplinary topics that will be presented by high-profile thinkers, international leaders, policymakers, corporate leaders, and leading scholars who are distinguished in their area of expertise and whose work have made a significant impact on the global community. Today, we are very fortunate that we have Professor Terence John O'Brien, who is the chair of medicine neurology and head of Central Clinical School, Monash University, and also the program director at Alfred Brain and deputy director of research at Alfred Health, who will be presenting the second Sir John Monash public lecture for the year on the topic entitled Sudden Unexpected Death in Epilepsy, which is called SUDEP, Brain versus Heart. So before we commence the lecture, please allow me to present Professor Terence John O'Brien. And as we know, Prof. Terence O'Brien do not need any introduction. He is a world-renowned epileptologist and scientist who is currently, as I mentioned, is a chair of medicine and neurology and head of Central Clinical School at Monash University, as well as program director at Alfred Brain and deputy director of research at Alfred Health. He was formerly the University of Melbourne's James Stewart Chair of Medicine and head of the Department of Medicine at the Royal Medical Hospitals from 2008 to 2017. And also Van Cleef Roed Chair of Neurosciences at Monash University and Director of Neurology at Alfred Health from 2017 to 2020. He's a specialist in neurology and clinical pharmacology with particular expertise in epilepsy and neurodegenerative diseases, preclinical and clinical trials, and in vivo imaging in animal models and humans. He did his clinical and research training at St. Vincent and Royal Melbourne Hospital in Melbourne, and then the Mayo Clinic, Rochester, Minnesota, USA from 1995 to 1998. He leads a large translational research team undertaking both basic studies and clinical studies focused on developing improved treatment for people with epilepsy and other related brain diseases, including traumatic brain injury, dementia, and brain tumors. He has been involved as a principal investigator in more than 100 commercially sponsored and investigator-initiated trials of new treatments of epilepsy, dementia, headache, movement disorders, and new PET radio traces. He has published more than 570 peer-reviewed original research papers in leading scientific and medical journals, which have been cited more than 24,000 and with an H index of 80 and I-10 index close to 400. He is currently the president of the Epilepsy Society of Australia since 2018. And according to the expert Escape, he is rated number 8 among the 110,459, which makes him top 0.002% of the epilepsy researchers or experts worldwide based on the selected articles from 2011. He has received 17 and more awards for his research from the national and international scientific bodies, including the very prestigious the Ambassador for Epilepsy Award from International League Against Epilepsy in 2017. Prof. O'Brien's profile is never ending, and it will probably need another hour to just introduce him. So without further ado, please welcome Professor Terence O'Brien to deliver his Sir John Monash Lecture on the very, very important topic, which is sudden unexpected death in epilepsy, SUDEP, brain versus heart. Professor Terence O'Brien, Zoom is yours. Take it away.
Thank you very much for that overly kind introduction, Farouk, and thank you very much to you and your colleagues for giving me the honour of presenting the Sir John Monash Lecture for the Monash University, Malaysia. Now, I'll just try and share my screen. Tell me if I've got that working. I'll put it on slideshow. That should be okay. I hope everyone can see it. Let me know if you can't. So, as Farouk mentioned, I'm going to be talking tonight about the tragic and unfortunately all too common complication of epilepsy, sudden unexpected death in epilepsy, or SUDEP, which is a condition that affects many people or many families who have epilepsy, unfortunately, and is still far too mysterious in our understanding of what causes it and how we can prevent it. But we are starting, this research over the last decade really has ramped up in a major way into this condition, and we are now starting to understand what the causes are and approaches to treatment. I apologise to anybody who was listening to my lecture last year for the Central Clinical School, where I also talked on this topic, and there's significant overlap, but it is such an important topic it's worth talking about more than once. And also we have some new important data that has been published over the last year, which I want to highlight. Like I did last time, I want to start with with Lucia's story. Lucia was the daughter of one of our family friends. I wasn't involved in her care. Her mother, who I think is on the lecture today, she told me she would be, has given me permission to share her story, because it illustrates not just the absolute tragedy that's in SUDEP, but also a number of the important features that I want to talk about in my lecture. So Lucia was a 13-year-old, otherwise healthy young girl or young woman. She did have a background history of congenital heart disease, which had simultaneously resolved, and she was developing as any normal young girl would. For about 3 years, she started having, her mother noticed, brief episodes when she'd be exposed to bright sunlight, where she would suddenly stop, her eyes would flicker, and her head would nod briefly. Her mother actually described these as mini fits, but despite reporting them to the general practitioner, they weren't diagnosed, though in retrospect they were almost certainly absence-type seizures. On the 28th of March last year, she had a single generalised tonic-clonic seizure in the context of a mild viral illness and having been staying up late playing on electronic devices, as a lot of young kids, of course, do these days. She was taken to the local hospital and subsequently assessed by a paediatrician as an outpatient, who felt she'd had a provoked seizure related to the viral illness and staying up late, and no further investigation or treatment was organised, and she was advised to avoid excessive screen time and late nights. Only a week later, her mother saw her late playing on the iPad, talking to friends in bed. I said goodnight, told her not to stay up too late. And the next morning found her face down in bed, cold, purple, not breathing. Ambulance was called. She was unable to be revived. A coroner investigation determined after the medical examiner's report that this was an unascertained cause of death. That has been appealed, and there's still the coroner's determination. However, reviewing the case, I have absolutely no doubt that this was a case of SUDEP and comes under the category of definite SUDEP plus. And we'll talk more about that, and also the problem about under-ascertainment of SUDEP in later in my lecture. It's a little bit of background about epilepsy for those who are not in the field. Epilepsy is an ancient condition. It's been with humanity since the beginning of time. It's not just one disease, it's a whole group of neurological conditions that have in common a ongoing predisposition to having recurrent spontaneous seizures. It affects all ages, all races, all countries, all social strata, all genders, and is one of the most common chronic serious neurological conditions worldwide. WHO recently in a report estimated that there's more than 50 million people across the globe who are affected by epilepsy at any one time. And in Australia, Deloitte Access Economics recently estimated there was about 150,000 people with active epilepsy in Australia. And they estimated the annual cost to the Australian economy of being $12.3 billion. Epilepsy is more than just seizures. As disabling and as dangerous and as nasty as seizures are, they are actually only part of the problem. Many people with epilepsy also have significant mental health and neurocognitive problems and other comorbidities. There are few conditions that carry such historical stigma and discrimination, and the restrictions that are put on people's life by having epilepsy in terms of driving and occupation and recreation are major causes of disability. But the focus of this lecture tonight is on mortality, and that is something that many people actually don't realise, or until recently, it wasn't a commonly recognised fact about epilepsy that it is a potentially fatal condition. And I've certainly heard many families who have been affected by SUDEP who said that they and their loved one had absolutely no idea that people could die from epilepsy. In fact, people who have epilepsy, even relatively well-controlled epilepsy, have a rate of mortality that is 3 times that of the general population when you look at age and gender matched controls. And this is significantly higher in the third of patients who have what we call drug-resistant epilepsy, which is epilepsy where the seizures cannot be controlled by anti-epileptic medications. There's a whole lot of ways that people can die from epilepsy. Some are obvious: car accidents, drowning, status epilepticus. The effects of mental health, suicide is significantly increased. But this condition, sudden unexpected death in epilepsy, is actually the most common cause of premature mortality in epilepsy. And people who have epilepsy have up to a 40 times increased risk of dying suddenly than people who are of the same age and gender. SUDEP particularly affects younger people. The median age is 35 years. And these are people who are in their prime of their life, who have little other reason to die. So when you look at the effect, and we'll talk a bit more about this, but in terms of years lost, it has a very disproportionate impact beyond conditions such as strokes or ischemic heart disease or dementias, which tend to occur later in life, and therefore the years of life lost are much less. So we talked a bit about definitions, and I think it's important to cover this at the beginning so we know what we're talking about. There was a number of different definitions of SUDEP that were used over the early years, but since about 2012, when the NOCEF agreed definitions were published, the field has very much fallen in behind these definitions as what is SUDEP. So SUDEP is when someone has had a sudden, unexpected, witnessed or unwitnessed, non-traumatic, non-drowning death that occurs in otherwise benign circumstances. In an individual with epilepsy, with or without the evidence of seizure, and excluding status epilepticus, which is prolonged seizure, and in which a post-mortem is performed that does not reveal the cause of death. And the most common circumstances for death in SUDEP is exactly what we saw in the chair, which is someone being found dead in bed in the morning. And there may have been some evidence that they had a seizure, but often it is unwitnessed. Then there's another category which is called definite SUDEP plus, which is what I believe the chair had. And this is when there's otherwise an unexpected death, but there may also be a second condition such as underlying heart condition that may have contributed to the death, but the primary cause of death was likely to have been related to the epilepsy. Then there is what's called probable or possible SUDEP, which is basically the same as definite SUDEP, in which there hadn't been an autopsy. And then there's possible SUDEP, which is where there is a competing cause of death, which may well have been the primary cause of death. And then there's near SUDEP, which is or near SUDEP plus, where someone basically has an arrest, but is revived and doesn't actually survives the attack, but you believe otherwise the person would have had a SUDEP if it hadn't been intervened. Why is SUDEP important? Well, I've already mentioned that it's a common epilepsy-related cause of premature death, and it's actually the second leading cause of neurological lost patient years in the world. As I mentioned, it occurs in healthy, commonly young people with few other reasons to die. The incidence in the general epilepsy population is between 1.1 and 5 per 1,000 patient years. But in patients with drug-resistant epilepsy, those that can't be controlled with standard medications, it goes up to almost 1% per year, which gives a cumulative incidence of about 10% over 10 years. And this is very similar to an unruptured Berry aneurysm. And I certainly remember our neurosurgical teachers talking about this like a ticking time bomb. So it is a really significant risk in people with uncontrolled epilepsy. There's estimated more than 100 SUDEPs in Australia and more than 3,000 in the US. But as I'll talk about, that's probably an under-ascertainment of the true incidence. And this is a really important article that was published by my good friend and first PhD student, Rosie Pinelli, who tragically passed away earlier this year. Rosie worked for the Epilepsy Foundation when she did her PhD with me about 15 years ago, and then subsequently became a really important advocate for the importance of raising awareness about SUDEP, and did an enormous amount of work with global organisations such as Epilepsy Bereaved, and for her work she was awarded the International Ambassador for Epilepsy by the International Bureau of Epilepsy and the International League Against Epilepsy. So this was some work that Rosie did and published a couple of years ago, where she looked at all the coroner's files in the ACT over about a 12-year period, and searched for any death where epilepsy or seizures were mentioned or could have been a SUDEP. And she found 75 epilepsy-related deaths. And very concerningly, in 31 or 41.3% of these cases, epilepsy or seizures were not listed at all in the cause of death, so would not have appeared in statistics about the incidence of SUDEP. But when she reviewed and I provided a second opinion, the cases, 53 of these cases would have, or 70% would have fulfilled the unified definition of SUDEP that I told you before, and 37 being definite SUDEP. but only 22 or 41.5% were identified by the coroner as SUDEP, and in 37.7 epilepsy or seizures convulsions were not of these SUDEP cases were not even mentioned. So this highlights the issue that medical examiners and the coroners are under ascertaining the incidence of SUDEP. And it's not just an Australian problem. This is another paper that was relatively recently published by our strong collaborators in New York, led by Oren Davinsky at New York University. And they looked at 220 SUDEP cases that there was a quarter of deaths determined by a medical examiner, and reviewed all the cases and found that only a third of them were SUDEP listed as the final cause of death. And this was particularly low when there were some other potentially contributing factors, such as we see Lucia with her history of congenital heart disease. And the medical examiners tend to focus in on that rather than recognising the epilepsy as the cause of death. Going back to the impact and the costs of epilepsy in Australia, and particularly the costs of premature mortality, this was work that was published last year by our group, led by a really talented young neurologist, Emma Foster, and Sarafina Andami, who's a health economist, and our fabulous statistician, Ben Chen. And they did some life table modelling with 2017 data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics and other statistical databases. And they modelled the productivity and mortality outcomes for working age Australians up to the age of 70. They assumed that 70% of the cohort achieved seizure-free status based on optimistic view of the numbers of people who should have their seizures controlled. And they calculated that epilepsy costs working age Australians almost 1,500 excess deaths, or 78,000 years lost. And this translated to almost 150,000 productivity adjusted years lost, life years lost because of premature mortality in epilepsy, with a loss of GDP of $32 billion. So this is an enormous cost to the Australian side, and you extrapolate that to Malaysia and other countries, and it has a similar impact. So optimistically, they did also show that if you could improve the seizure freedom rate by as little as 5% from a base of 70 to 75%, that this would result in $53 million reduction in direct healthcare costs, a prevention of 811 excess deaths, a total of almost 4,000 years of life gain, and 17,000 productivity adjusted life years, and almost $4 billion of cost saving. So this is really the challenge for the field, is to try and improve our treatment of epilepsy so that we're controlling seizures in more people. And this will have an enormous benefit to society, both in reducing mortality and also saving costs. So how do we control seizures? Well, the standard way that we treat and control seizures, and had done so back to the 1800s, in fact, is with anti-seizure medications, or what were called anti-epileptic medications. Now, these are symptomatic medications. They do not do anything to change the underlying epileptic substrate, and patients stop taking their medications or is likely to have a seizure as if they never took it in the first place. But they can be effective in a proportion of patients in controlling seizures. And over the last 3 decades, we've had an explosion in the number of new anti-epileptic medications available to prescribe to our patients. This is seminal data from my friend and close colleague, Professor Patrick Kwan, who, when he was doing his PhD with Martin Brodie in Scotland, published what he tells me is the most cited paper in epilepsy. And what they did was looked at the outcome of newly treated epilepsy by going into the basements of the medical records in Edinburgh and following the files of over 400 patients. And what they found is that about just under 50% of patients, 47% of patients will have their seizure controlled with the first medication that they put on. Then another 13% will be controlled with the second medication. But after that, you're really on a losing wicket. It didn't matter how many other medications or combinations of medications you tried, about a third of patients continue to have seizures. And these are patients with what is called drug-resistant epilepsy. So Patrick, as you do, sent his protege, young Ben Chen, and that shouldn't be unpublished. Sorry, that was published in JAMA Neurology a couple of years ago. And he repeated the analysis in the era of the new anti-epileptic drugs that I showed you before to see whether anything has improved. And if you toggle back and forth between these two pie charts, you'll see that nothing has really changed. We still have a third of patients with epilepsy who we can't control their seizures. And as I said, that really is the area of challenge for new drug development, is to develop new treatments that don't just control the same 2/3 that we're currently controlling, but start to eat into that red part of the pie graph. And this is that data from that JAMA Neurology paper that just shows that over time, when you go back to 1982 and when the Patrick first did his analysis, most patients were on carbamazepine or valproate or phenytoin. Now, by the later part of the last decade, you have most patients being on newer drugs, lamotrigine, oxcarbazine, gabapentin, levetiracetam, etc. And this looks at the probability of seizure freedom across 3 different decades in that cohort. And you can see that the proportion of patients that became seizure-free, about 2/3 of patients, has not changed one little bit. And why is it so important to achieve seizure freedom? This is the outcome that's most consistently been associated with improved quality of life in patients treated either medically or surgically for epilepsy. Uncontrolled seizures or drug-resistant epilepsy have an increased incidence of injury, greater medication burden, increased psychiatric comorbidities, greater socioeconomic disadvantage, reduced quality of life, and most importantly for the topic of today's lecture, an increased incidence of death, both accidental and severe. So what are the major risk factors of SUDEP? Well, number one is ongoing drug-resistant seizures. Just having drug-resistant seizures increased your risk of SUDEP by 6 times. Patients who are on polytherapy, who have high intellectual or neurological impairment or higher seizure frequency are at increased risk for SUDEP, largely because of the impact of frequent seizures. If your seizures are convulsive seizures, then that rate goes up even further to 10 times. And if you're having frequent convulsive seizures with 3 or more tonic-clonic seizures in the last 12 months, the increased risk of sudden death is 15 times. Nocturnal seizures are also particularly associated with an increased risk of death. Inadequate treatment, either through under-treatment, subtherapeutic levels, or medication non-adherence, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, are all associated with increased risk of SUDEP. Living alone, being unattended, is associated with increased risk of SUDEP, and there is some evidence that if someone is stimulated when they have in that post-ictal phase, you may be able to abort a SUDEP, and that's that near SUDEP that I mentioned before. And substance abuse and alcohol dependence seems to also be associated with increased risk of death, as does data from our group led by Jared Toe that showed that if you have an associated psychiatric comorbidity, which is present at least 30 or 40% of patients with epilepsy, you have an increased risk of SUDEP. So why does SUDEP occur? Well, physiologically, there's 3 major possibilities. One is that it's primarily a cardiac death, and that seizures, which are a major cardiovascular stress, can induce a cardiac arrhythmia, maybe on the top of an underlying genetic cardiochannelopathy or underlying structural cardiac disease, and that induces a malignant arrhythmia and therefore a primary cardiac death. It's still triggered by the seizures or in some way related to the epilepsy. Second possibility is respiratory death. This some evidence for this is that patients are often found in bed and face down, And so maybe in the post-ictal phase, there's airway obstruction, resulting in hypoxia and neurogenic pulmonary edema and potentially then cardiopulmonary arrest. But as I'll show, the mechanism that seems to be primary, at least from the direct evidence we have at the moment, is a primary cerebral death, where you have a generalized shutdown of brain cerebral electrical activity after a seizure, which then results in secondary cardiopulmonary changes and then ultimately a terminal cardiac cardiorespiratory arrest and death. However, I certainly believe, and I think the field is largely coming around this view, that there's not a single unitary cause for SUDEP in all patients. In fact, it's most likely a heterogeneous condition. And it's likely that all three mechanisms are involved to at least some degree in different patient populations, but their various contributions will vary from patient to patient. The most direct evidence that we have for the mechanisms of SUDEP come from this really important study, the Mortimer study, which was published in 2013 and led by Philippe Reglon from France, and involved 130 epilepsy monitoring units across the world, including our unit at the Royal Melbourne Hospital. And they took advantage, so to speak, of the really uncommon but tragic circumstance of where someone who's having continuous video EEG monitoring in hospital for evaluation of their epilepsy died, and then went back and reviewed the video EEG recordings to understand the mechanisms of what happened. They found 16 cases where there had been a SUDEP during the video EEG monitoring period, and 11 of these they had recordings with EEG and cardiac recordings. There was in addition, 9 cases of immediate SUDEP where the patients were revived, thankfully. All of the SUDEPs occurred following a seizure. So these didn't occur in between seizures, and they all occurred at night. And 14 out of 16 cases, the patients were lying prone and face down, which, as I said, is the most common position for someone to die of SUDEP. When they looked at the EEG and ECG recordings during the seizure, after the seizure, and during the SUDEP, they found this characteristic pattern. It started with the seizure, and then following the seizure, there was a general cerebral shutdown, which is manifest on the EEG as generalized suppression of the EEG activity. Then secondary to that, and often several minutes down the track, you had a respiratory hypopnea, which is decreased respirations, and cardiac slowing, ultimately cardiac asystole, which then fed back and exacerbated and prolonged the cerebral shutdown because of lack of oxygenation of the brain. And this ultimately resulted in a terminal apnea and a terminal cardiac asystole. So this primary cerebral mechanism seemed to be the main or the exclusive cause in these cases that were captured on video EEG monitoring. However, this is obviously a very specific circumstance with a small number of patients monitored in hospital with medications withdrawn in the majority of cases. So it's probably not surprising that each one of these followed a seizure. And there is quite a bit of evidence that, in fact, not all SUDEPs do directly follow a seizure, and that this cerebral shutdown mechanism is probably not the only cause. Not all patients who experience SUDEP have had a recent seizure, and not all of them have had a recent convulsive seizure. And we now have increasing evidence from animal studies, which I'll present some from our group, but also from human studies, that patients with chronic epilepsy have a high incidence of cardiac electrophysiological and structural abnormalities that could predispose them to malignant cardiac arrhythmias, either as a response to a seizure or at other times. Ion channel mutations that we know are a common cause of genetic epilepsy. Those same ion channels are often expressed in the heart. And so this could result in a dual phenotype where you have a channelopathy causing electrical abnormalities in the brain, which results in epilepsy, and electrical abnormalities in the heart, which results in a predisposition to cardiac arrhythmias. And during a seizure, you get this profound autonomic storm of aberrant sympathetic and parasympathetic inputs, which results in major changes in cardiac rhythm, rate, and function. So if someone does have an underlying cardiac abnormality, be it electrophysiological or structural, it's easy to see why this major cardiac stress could trigger a malignant arrhythmia. But there's also a chicken and egg element to this, and there's increasing evidence, and I'll show from some of our rat studies, that the effect on the heart of repeated seizures, and particularly this repeated aberrant autonomic storm, can result in a secondary change in the heart and cause a pattern that looks like a restrictive cardiomyopathy, which then may act as an underlying predisposition to cardiac arrhythmias and sudden death. Just some of this evidence. This is a Dutch study in which they looked at 185 patients with chronic epilepsy, looking at their electrocardiograms, and found significant abnormalities in 39%. And this was a variety of abnormalities, but included prolonged QT intervals and other cardiac abnormalities that are known to be associated with increased risk of malignant arrhythmias. And importantly, these changes were more common in people who had a longer duration of epilepsy, so more exposure to repeated seizures to damage the heart, had frequent tonic-clonic seizures, and had acquired etiology for epilepsy. All the groups that we know have an increased risk of SUDEP. Another study from, again, also from Holland, found that using a population-based approach, that just having epilepsy was a risk factor for cardiac arrest with ventricular fibrillation, so that the incidence was 2 or 3 times increased on the general population. This was a study that was published somewhat time ago, but it was a very intriguing study, a relatively small number of patients, where they used continuous subcutaneous loop recorders to record the ongoing ECG activity over a long period of time in people with epilepsy. And they found 21% of the patients had a significant cardiac arrhythmia, particularly bradycardias, that required pacemaker insertion. And 3 of the 4 of these were felt to be potentially resulting in potentially fatal asystole. So this study has been done again by our group, led by Shobi Simbalambo, a outstanding postdoc in our group in the Department of Neuroscience at Monash University. Her study is currently under review at Neurology, fingers crossed, and found very, very similar findings. Of 31 patients who had prolonged loop recorder, 3 of them, 9.7%, had serious cardiac arrhythmias detected, 2 with sinus arrest with ventricular asystole, and 1 with ventricular tachycardia, all of whom needed cardiological intervention. Another related study that Shobi was led with an outstanding medical student, Russell Nightscales, who has worked with our group for some time, and also my friend and colleague, Associate Professor Puro Peruka, who is now head of the epilepsy program at the Austin Hospital in Melbourne. And they reported a case that a 43-year-old man who had a 21-year history of drug-resistant focal epilepsy with frequent convulsive seizures, who during video monitoring, it was noted that following a seizure, he had 12 hours, following 2 seizures, he had 12 hours of paroxysmal atrial fibrillation. And 26 months later, was found to have died of SUDEP. And in fact, other groups have also reported that paroxysmal atrial fibrillation may be a marker of risk for SUDEP. And so this is more evidence of chronic epilepsy being associated with cardiac arrhythmias that potentially could contribute to the risk of SUDEP. This was with further work done by Shobi as part of her PhD. In our program at both Royal Melbourne at the Alfred, we have a system where we've set it up so patients can have a full polysomnogram in the last day of their video EEG recording, which allows us to uniquely look at, in a detailed way, cardiorespiratory function and autonomic function around the time of the seizure, during the seizure and following the seizure and leading up to a seizure. So she looked at the cardiorespiratory data from 70 consecutive patients who had 18 convulsive and 139 non-convulsive seizures captured on this dual video EEG and polysomnogram system. And she plotted over time from in the 3 minutes before a seizure and then in the up to 5 minutes after a seizure, changes in heart rate and changes in respiratory rate here. And you can see just before the clinical seizure occurs, clinical electrographic seizure occurs, there's an increase, dramatic increase in the heart rate, which was significantly greater in the patients who had convulsive seizures. But really importantly, that heart rate stayed elevated for a long time post-seizure. It didn't just immediately come back to normal as the non-convulsive seizures did. And likewise, in the patients who had convulsive seizures with a respiratory rate, you get an elevation of respiratory rate which remained elevated from baseline for more than 5 minutes following the end of the seizure. And when it did more sophisticated analysis, looking at heart rate variability, you saw with the convulsive seizure, there was a dramatic increase in heart rate variability around the time of the seizure. And that then slowly came back to baseline. But when you looked at patients who had this feature called seizure generalized EEG suppression, where you get that flat EEG indicating that cerebral shutdown, that heart rate variability remained elevated for 5 minutes following the seizure, indicating in this group of patients you had a sustained irregularity of the cardiac rhythm, which is known to be a marker of significant risk for cardiac arrhythmias. So deranged heart rate variability is well established in the cardiac literature as being a marker of central autonomic dysregulation, and is a marker of increased risk for sudden death in patients following a cardiac ischemic event. So in collaboration with our colleagues at NYU, led by Oren Davinsky, who I mentioned before in that medical examiner under ascertainment study, Shobi led a multi-center case control study on 31 patients who are admitted to both of our video EEG monitoring units over a decade, who had suddenly died from SUDEP, and compared this with 56 epilepsy controls, so people with epilepsy who didn't die and who had video EEG monitoring, and 60 healthy controls. And very pleasingly, as of today, this paper has been accepted for publication in Neurology. So this is really fresh off the press data. Shobi and her team did time-based and frequency domain-based analysis of the heart rate variability from 5 minutes of individual electrocardiogram recordings in sleep and during wakefulness. So not prolonged recordings, just a very small snapshot of the EEG recording. So something that could be quite easily done in outpatient practice. And what they found during wakefulness was that there was a significant decrease during this snapshot of individual ECG recording in the heart rate variability in the patients who suddenly died, who subsequently died of SUDEP, compared to those who with epilepsy didn't die and healthy controls. And in fact, they found that for each 1% incremental reduction in low frequency power percentage corresponded to a 2.4% decrease in the latency of to SUDEP. So they died much quicker the lower the decrease in low frequency potential. Now this data needs to be validated in other studies, and with Oren we've got now an NIH grant from the US Institute of Health that will allow us to do this in a prospective international multi-center study, validate this biomarker. But it could well be a biomarker that you can use in practice to identify patients that are at a higher risk of having a sudden unexplained death, and then putting in interventions to try and prevent that. So it could be a very important and clinically applicable finding. So I mentioned that there is many ion channels that are expressed in both the heart and also in the brain that could represent a cause for this dual phenotype of cardiac arrhythmia and brain arrhythmia, resulting in epilepsy and cardiac arrhythmias. So a number of these channels includes sodium channels, potassium channels, T-type calcium channels, and these channels called HCN channels. All mutations in all of these are known to increase the QT interval on the ECG, which is a predisposing factor for malignant ventricular arrhythmias. And in fact, mutations in these genes, all of these genes have been found by Kristen Smanian's group in Sydney, collaborating with Ingrid Sheffer from Melbourne, to be present in about 10% of patients with SUDEP, providing evidence that these underlying genetic changes in the heart and brain may actually be predisposing some people to be more likely to die of SUDEP. So we've looked at the underlying electrophysiological and structural changes in hearts in our little furry friends. We're to try and understand something that's very difficult to do in clinical research, and that is the cause and effect. Do the seizures cause the heart changes, or the heart changes come along and are part of the basic underlying pathophysiology that causes the epilepsy? Now, rats are ideally suited to this because you can actually study them before the epilepsy develops. Where in people, they don't present before their epilepsy, they present with their epilepsy. So trying to understand what is there beforehand is really difficult. So we used this model called the post-canic acid status epilepticus model, which is a model of temporal lobe epilepsy. The animals have a period of prolonged seizures, they then recover, and then start manifesting recurrent spontaneous seizures, which, like in human temporal lobe epilepsy, are drug resistant and so are difficult to completely control with medications. And we did both in vivo recordings, that means when the rats are running around the cage, and also took out the hearts and did, in collaboration with our colleagues at the Monash Institute of Pharmacy, did recordings on the hearts separated in a perfusion chamber, which took out all the inputs into the heart from nerves and brain and other things, and just look at what was the intrinsic changes within the heart. And without wasting too much time, what we found was that the epileptic rats had significant changes in a number of markers on their ECG. Their RR interval, the QT interval, as I've mentioned several times, been a really important marker of increased risk for arrhythmias, and the ST intervals. And none of these were present in rats prior to the development of epilepsy. This was evidence that giving animals epilepsy and them having chronic seizures did result in really significant changes to the heart. We also looked at expression of a number of these ion channels I mentioned, and this one looks at these HCN channels, which I won't go through the electrophysiology for time's sake, but basically these HCN channels are like the pacemaker channels of the heart, and they are really important in dictating how the heart beats in a regular manner. And when you have changes in these HCN expressions, it causes disturbance in the regularity of the heartbeat and predisposes to malignant cardiac arrhythmias. And what we found is particularly this subgroup of the HCN channels, it was significantly decreased in the hearts of the rats, the epileptic rats, compared to the control non-epileptic rats, indicating that the epilepsy itself can actually induce these cardiac changes as a result of having chronic epilepsy. Because these animals don't have genetic epilepsy. We also, in another experiment, which just has been accepted for publication in the last few weeks in neurobiology disease, did echocardiograms in collaboration with our colleagues in the Department of Lee Delbridge and Department of Physiology at University of Melbourne. So we did echocardiograms prior to the status epilepticus at 2 weeks following the status epilepticus when the epilepsy is just getting started, and at 10 weeks after the animals were chronically epileptic, and found that the animals in the chronic epileptic state, but not prior to epilepsy and not early on in epilepsy, had a significant abnormal electrocardiogram with a reduction in this measure called ejection fraction, which is basically the amount of blood that the heart is able to pump with each beat, significantly down in the epileptic animals when they were chronically epileptic. And importantly, there was a very significant relationship to how many seizures the animals were expressing. So evidence that having chronic epilepsy and having frequent seizures resulted in changes and significant changes in the cardiac function. We also looked staining for fibrosis in fibrin distribution in the heart. We looked at that, and in the non-epileptic animals, we didn't see any. The animals had a small amount of seizures. We saw some. This is the red staining here. But the animals who had really severe epilepsy, major changes in fibrin distribution in the heart. And fibrosis in the heart is well known to affect cardiac function, reduce the ejection fraction, makes your heart stiffer, and also predisposes it to malignant cardiac arrhythmias. And you see here, again, the amount of fibrosis was very highly correlated with the number of seizures the animals are expressing at the 10-week time point, and inversely correlated with their ejection fraction. So those with more seizures had more fibrosis, had worse ejection fraction. The Delbridge group also looked at individual muscle cells isolated by themselves and found that those individual muscle cells were not contracting as the control non-epileptic animals were. And again, there was a strong relationship to the numbers of seizures that the animals were expressing, showing that having chronic epilepsy actually had a long-term effect on the muscle cells themselves. And this is not just a rat phenomenon. There is now a building evidence when people have looked in clinical populations that patients with chronic epilepsy not uncommonly have structural cardiac pathology. I've mentioned the electrophysiological changes that before, but this is a study, this is a review article that looked at 11 studies covering 288 patients with SUDEP who had died of SUDEP where they reported cardiac pathology, and 25% of them showed significant findings, including cardiac myocyte hypertrophy, as we saw in the rats, and also myocardial fibrosis we saw in the rats. And electrocardiogram studies in the patients with chronic epilepsy have also commonly reported many of the same changes that we saw in the rats, with changes that resemble a restrictive cardiomyopathy. So another issue that we've examined, which has become very topical in the clinical epilepsy world, is this scare about lamotrigine and other sodium channel modulators that was put out earlier this year and late last year by the US Food and Drug Administration, FDA, that these very, very commonly prescribed anti-epileptic medications could induce a serious cardiac arrhythmia, an increase in sudden death in patients who had structural or ischemic cardiac disease, which, as I mentioned, is actually very common in people with epilepsy. And this was prompted by some experimental data, not in animals and not in humans, but in cells that demonstrated these drugs had effect on the sodium channels, which are one of those ion channels I mentioned that are expressed in the brain and in the heart, and could induce pro-arrhythmic effects. So we felt this was really important to look at in our patient populations, and in collaboration with the NYU group again, we have just submitted to Neurology a study where we looked at 103 SUDEP cases and 210 matched controls who had been admitted to video EEG monitoring. So we had all their EEG and clinical and electrophysiological data over a almost 20-year period that were linked to the National Death Index. So we knew comprehensively who had died and who hadn't died. And very reassuringly, we found when you looked at a survival graph of death over time, and the red bars are the patients who were not taking lamotrigine at the time of their admission, and the blue were those that were. In fact, the patients with lamotrigine, not significantly different, but were not dying any more frequently and did not have SUDEP any more frequently than those who were not taking lamotrigine. In fact, if anything, it was a little less frequently. And then looking at other sodium channel blockers like carbamazepine and nicotinamide, phenytoin, etc., even when you had 2 or 3 of those drugs together, you still weren't dying more frequently than those who were not on a sodium channel modulator. So this is really very reassuring data for the epilepsy community that in fact these drugs are safe to prescribe in people with epilepsy. And given that the most important thing to do to prevent SUDEP is to control seizures, it's actually really important. These drugs play a really important role in that. So how do we prevent SUDEP? The most important modifiable risk factor for SUDEP is seizure control, particularly convulsive seizures. And the primary goal of epilepsy management should be to obtain as complete seizure control as possible. I always say to my patients that when they say, well, how well controlled should I be? I said, well, we need to aim for seizure freedom. We don't always achieve that, but we always aim for that. And we'll work really hard to try and achieve that if possible. As I mentioned before, medical treatment with anti-epileptic drugs should be able to control 60 or 70% of people with epilepsy. And if it can't, then you need to consider whether they could be candidates for epilepsy surgery, which in patients with drug-resistant epilepsy is really the only treatment that has prospect of seizure freedom. And in ideal surgical candidates, patients can become seizure-free in 60 to 80% of the cases. And worldwide surgery is absolutely underutilized for people with drug-resistant epilepsy. So we should be referring more patients into surgical programs with doing surgery with drug-resistant epilepsy. So does effective treatment reduce the risk of epilepsy? Well, there's increasing evidence that, you know, however you control the seizures, whether it's by drugs, whether it's by surgery, whether it's by neurostimulation, whatever you do to control the seizures will reduce the risk of SUDEP. So this is a really important study also by my friend Philippe Revlon from France, who looked at a large number of clinical trials of anti-epileptic drugs versus placebos as add-on treatments for new anti-epileptic drugs in patients with drug-resistant epilepsy. And what they found was that in patients who were randomized to the new treatment, who overall had about 30 or 40% improvement in seizure frequency in most of these trials, they had a significantly reduced risk of SUDEP compared to those that were randomized to the placebo dose. So strong evidence that improving the seizure control reduced the SUDEP risk. Another bit of evidence that's come from a number of sources is that when you don't take the tablets properly, and you have more seizures, you're more likely to have SUDEP. A really important study from Ed Pearl in the US and published in Neurology in 2008 on the basis of Medicare prescription data found that during periods when the patients were adherent versus non-adherent, which is defined as taking at least 74% of your medications, they had, so during the non-adherent periods, they had a higher instance of ED visits, hospital admissions, motor vehicle accidents and fractures, and importantly, an increased risk of mortality of over 3 times. compared to when they were actually taking the medications properly. A more recent study from Sweden, published in Neurology last year, specifically looked at SUDEP, not just overall death, and found that during periods of non-adherence, there was a 3 times increased risk of SUDEP. So not taking your tablets properly is a major modifiable risk factor for SUDEP. Epilepsy, what about epilepsy surgery? Well, there's a number of studies that looked at this. This is just one, but it highlights it really strongly. This was a British study which looked at patients who had epilepsy surgery, almost 600 patients, and a little over 600 patients who had drug-resistant epilepsy but to continue to be managed medically. Not surprisingly, the surgical group had a higher rate of seizure control and had a significantly reduced rate of death, 19 compared to 40, and epilepsy-related deaths were 7 compared to 24. And importantly, those that had epilepsy surgery that continued to have ongoing seizures were 5 times as likely to die as those who remained seizure-free. So more evidence that better seizure control that results in a reduced risk of SUDEP. Similarly, neurostimulation is now increasingly becoming a popular alternative for patients who have drug-resistant epilepsy but are not suitable for a receptive epilepsy surgery. And whether that's by the vagal nerve stimulator, DBS, or RNS, there's now evidence that, that patients treated with these devices have a reduced risk of death, which reflects an improved seizure control. What about other potential preventative measures? Well, I did mention supervision at night, and this has been found by several studies to be significantly protective when there's a partner who shares the same bedroom or somebody who is able to observe the patient, or potentially when there's special listening devices. This is again data from the Swedish group, found that patients who had generalized tonic-clonic seizures but did not have someone sharing the bedroom had a 67 times increased risk odds ratio of death compared to 18.65 if they had someone sharing the bedroom. So a 5 times reduction in risk of death if you had someone sharing the bedroom. Oxygen administration and repositioning after generalized tonic-clonic seizures, not proven, but may help. Educating people who live with patients with epilepsy and how to perform appropriate first aid and look after someone after seizure, protect the airways, may help. And there's a number of devices which have been reported to potentially help, but none of them are proven yet, including anti-suffocation pillows and various monitoring devices. I think the most important preventative method, however, is to make sure that you discuss with your patients and their families about SUDEP, so they're aware, you increase the awareness and educate them about the important relationship of seizure control to the risk of SUDEP, so they understand why they need to take their medications and manage their epilepsy properly. And I often say to patients that, I can't manage your epilepsy. I can only give you advice so you can manage your epilepsy, and really give them the power and the motivation to manage their epilepsy the best as they can. But unfortunately, historically, very few medical practitioners, including neurologists, mention SUDEP to patients, and when they do, it's often very late in the course of their treatment. But if you ask patients and families, they want to be provided with this information. And in fact, the biggest complaint with the medical profession that families of victims of SUDEP have is that they weren't informed, and their loved one was not informed about this risk, because otherwise they may well have managed their epilepsy in a different way if they had known about the risk. UK guidelines now do recommend all patients with epilepsy and their families provided with information about SUDEP. And I really try now to introduce this at the very beginning of the consultation, not in in a scary way, not in a pejorative way, but just as part of the conversation about why we would recommend that someone take medications for their epilepsy. And allows an informed decision by the patient regarding treatment, adherence, and nocturnal supervision. And this has become really a major cause in the epilepsy support organisations. And this is a SUDEP Action, a UK-based group that Rosie Pinelli worked with, that have done an enormous job in raising community awareness, as have the Epilepsy Foundation and Epilepsy Action in Australia. So to conclude, just some key points to recapitulate on from my lecture today. Firstly, SUDEP is an important cause of premature death in people with epilepsy. The mechanism likely involves a combination of central respiratory and cardiac mechanisms. The biggest risk factor is lack of seizure control, particularly nocturnal generalized convulsive seizures. The incidence can likely be reduced by effective medical or surgical treatments that better control seizures. And we need more research to identify biomarkers in individual patients, such as that heart rate variability on the ECG that we reported with the NYU group, that will allow us to stratify patients into individual risks and help target preventative treatments. And probably most importantly, for doctors to discuss SUDEP with their patients and families, and to raise community awareness. So just to acknowledge the many people who, from our group in the Monash Department of Neuroscience, collaborators, Vaughan Mainsfield Baker, our NYU collaborators, and other collaborators across the Epilepsy Melbourne groups, most of whom I mentioned in my talk already. And thank you again, Farouk, and everyone from Monash Malaysia on the honour of allowing me to do this lecture tonight. And,
wonderful.
Questions.
Sorry, yeah. I think there are a number of questions in the Q&A, and I'll try to read for you if you want. The first question from an anonymous attendee is talking about, can you explain in more lay terms the breakdown of process of SUDEP under observation? You mentioned lung, heart impacted. Did the lung and heart stop working or just slow down enough to impact the brain?
So the best direct evidence we have is from that Mortimer study that I mentioned, but it's important to recognise there was only 11 patients who had the video and the EEG and the ECG recorded during that. So it's a small number of patients, but it does give us the best evidence of what happens. And the order basically goes brain. So you have your seizure, major electrical overload, the seizure stops, the brain is exhausted and shuts down. And you'll see on the ECG the flatness of the EEG on the ECG. That results then in cardiac rhythm changes and respiratory breathing changes. And then that then seems to result in an anoxia to the brain, which compounds that cerebral shutdown. And then that becomes a self-fulfilling cycle, and then you get a cardiorespiratory arrest and then death. So the brain, in those Mortimer's case, the brain seemed to be the primary mechanistic driver of these cases. But we do believe, for all the reasons I amplified, that there are other cases where in fact it's more a cardiac rhythm, which may still be triggered by a seizure, but it's not that cerebral shutdown mechanism, but rather the seizure triggers on the basis of an underlying cardiological abnormality, a malignant arrhythmia that causes a cardiac arrest. So there's likely more than one mechanism. And there's probably other cases where people have a blocking of their airway because of how they're positioned, and you have a primary respiratory death. So I think all three mechanisms can be at play in different people.
All right. Another question is about, is there a common thread of location of seizures in the brain for uncontrolled epilepsy?
No. Any seizure localization can be drug resistant, is the bottom line. And as you're probably aware, epilepsy can be broadly divided into focal epilepsies, where the seizures start from a geographically restricted part of the brain, and generalized epilepsies, which often have a genetic basis, where the seizures start in the diffuse networks in both hemispheres. Both focal epilepsies and generalized epilepsies can be drug resistant. Maybe focal epilepsies are a little more common to be drug resistant, but it also depends on the age group. So all types of epilepsy can be drug resistant, or most types of epilepsy can be drug resistant, I should say.
Okay, thanks, Troy. Next question is from Philip Wong, and I think she's asking what is the empirical data linking the brain tumors to epilepsy, and she's giving a bit of her background, like she got operated in 2015 for her tumors because she was having a petit mal and tumor non-malignant, but they removed 2/3 due to high risk.
Yeah. So good question. So this is a really important point. I did touch on at the beginning of my lecture, is that epilepsy is not just one disease. It's not a disease. It's a symptom of many different diseases. And it can be a primary condition where the epilepsy is the primary manifestation of the condition, or it can be secondary to something else that has affected the brain's electrical stability. And that's often called acquired epilepsy. And there's many different reasons you can acquire epilepsy. One of them is brain tumors. There's also brain trauma and strokes and alterings. But brain tumors are a not uncommon cause of acquired epilepsy. About 50% of people with brain tumors will have epilepsy as a symptom of their brain tumor. And this is another area that our group has done quite a lot of research in. We have a lot of interest in this particular area. We have a strong collaboration with our neurosurgical colleagues and have done a lot of work with tumor resections and understanding the underlying biology. And there's a building evidence that there's an excitatory neurotransmitter called glutamate, which is produced in excess in brain tumors, which leaks into the surrounding brain and is very, very hyperexcitable substance and results in electrical instability and seizures in the surrounding brain, which is why even when you remove the primary tumor, you may actually not stop the epilepsy, because this glutamate is leaked into the surrounding brain and change the surrounding brain even where the tumor is not involved.
Okay, wonderful. Another question from another anonymous attendee is asking about if somebody's seizure free for 3 years, is there any chance of recurrence even after the medication stop?
Yeah. So this is a really important and commonly asked question. So when people who do, that 2/3 that do well and have the seizures controlled, can I come off my medications at some point? Patients commonly ask this question, particularly women who might want to become pregnant and worried about the effects of the drugs. So once you've been seizure free for 2 years, it does associate with the increased chance that you will be successfully able to come off your medications without having seizure recurrence. But there is no point in time where there is no risk. So about 1/3 of patients who have been seizure free for 2 years, who have a normal MRI and a normal EEG and no other neurological problem, about 1/3 of them will have recurrence of their seizures when they come off medications. So there's always that risk the seizures will come back. You don't know while you're still taking the medication whether the epilepsy gone into remission or the reason you haven't had a seizure is because the medications are working. And ultimately, the only way to find out is to actually come off medications and see. And the biggest time for recurrent seizures is the first 3 to 6 months, which is why the Road Traffic Authority says that you must go at least 3 months after coming off medications before you can start driving again.
Okay. I think another question is about the drug resistance and at what time the drug resistance develop, and is there any risk which can induce drug resistance?
Yeah, a good question. So drug-resistant epilepsy, I think is often diagnosed much too late, and patients are subject to repeated seizures on when they could potentially be candidates for epilepsy surgery and to control the seizures. And this was, one of the main messages out of Patrick Kwan's work, that after someone has failed 2 medications, the chances that they'll become seizure-free with all trying the 17 other medications available is virtually 0. So you should be diagnosing a drug-resistant epilepsy early and considering to whether they could be epilepsy surgery cases. The question of whether drug-resistant epilepsy develops over time or was always there at the beginning is one that's not really certain, and it's probably a bit of both. There are probably forms of epilepsy, such as mesial temporal lobe epilepsy, that do get worse over time, and post-traumatic epilepsy is probably another example. But there's other forms of epilepsy where they're probably drug-resistant from the very beginning, and are not progressive.
I think next question is about whether we can generalize the heart and brain connection, even somebody do not have any other prior problem, and if that can be affected in those patients.
Yeah. So what I think I was trying to point out with some of the experimental literature I did is that there's probably it's a two-way interaction. That there are some patients who have an underlying genetic cardiac abnormality, and we saw this in 10% of patients with SUDEP, that they're probably born with, that causes both the epilepsy and the predisposition to cardiac arrhythmias. But just having epilepsy, uncontrolled epilepsy itself, as we see with the rat data, can produce the secondary cardiomyopathy, which then makes you more predisposed to having a cardiac arrhythmia. So it's probably a bit of both. Some people are born with a predisposition, or it's genetic, and some people it's acquired by the poorly controlled seizures.
Thanks for that question for Harpreet. Next is Jennifer asking, is SUDEP genetic?
So yeah, I sort of just answered that question. So there are some cases where 10% in postmortems where they identify genetic abnormalities in ion channels that would predispose to cardiac arrhythmias as well as the epilepsy. So some cases it probably is, but it probably is the minority of cases.
Okay. Sorry, the next question is from Veronica Sullivan, and she's asking from her son's story. My son fits classic definition of death by SUDEP. Family history of epilepsy, died at 33, lived alone, found prone position and lifeless in his home. He had a history of alcohol abuse, and interestingly, on autopsy, his BL was 0. He had a very strong precognitive awareness of his pending death. Have you encountered this before in your research?
Yeah, look, I mean, sadly, that does sound like a very, very typical history of someone who's died of SUDEP, had many of the risk factors that I highlighted in my lecture. I think the impending sense that they're going to die, I think many patients don't have that actually. I think, in fact, it's quite the opposite, that they don't realise that their epilepsy is potentially dangerous and potentially deadly, partly because no one's ever told them that. So, I think more often than not, it's a case of people not actually being educated about the risks of death that come with epilepsy.
Okay, I think next question, Wisheng is asking, is there any best treatment or best AED to treat SUDEP?
Yes, AED to suit. So no, well, as I mentioned in my treatment part of the SUDEP talk, the best, whatever method you do that successfully controls the seizures, that's the best treatment to prevent SUDEP. So in some patients, that'll be one type of medication or the other type of medication, and patients vary in which medications they respond to. In some people, it will be epilepsy surgery because they're drug resistant. In some people, it might be neurostimulation. And we're increasingly using the ketogenic modified Atkins diet as a adjunct treatment in epilepsy. But I don't think in itself any particular one form of treatment is a better preventer of SUDEP. It's whatever controls the seizures in that individual. That's the key.
Yeah, I think the next question is very common from the patients as well as the caregiver. Is there any cure for epilepsy at all?
Well, yes, yes and no. So none of the anti-epileptic drugs or anti-seizure drugs are curative in any way. And that's something that we are also working on in our laboratory, is to try and develop drugs that we call anti-epileptic drugs or disease-modifying drugs that may result in some in potentially curing the epilepsy, or changing people who have drug-resistant epilepsy, drug-responsive epilepsy. But people can be cured of their epilepsy. Sometimes epilepsy goes into remission of its own right. Sometimes epilepsy surgery can cure epilepsy. Generally, we don't aim with epilepsy surgery to cure the epilepsy. We aim to control the seizures, so taking someone from drug-resistant to drug-responsive. But at least a third of patients who have successful epilepsy surgery will come off their medications and not ever have a seizure again. And that is, by the definition, cure of epilepsy: no seizures, no drugs. So at this stage, epilepsy surgery is the only curative treatment that we have. But there is also patients who go into spontaneous remission and don't have epilepsy anymore. So in some ways, they've cured themselves.
Yeah. Next question is from my good friend Christina from Ireland. She's thanking you for the amazing talk, and how do you see the contribution from the studies analyzing whole genome exome sequencing or RNA sequencing, which can support the possibility of preventing SUDEP?
Yeah, so I think the main, this is a very rapidly evolving area, of course. The main contribution genomic studies have done so far is to identify that there is a portion of patients who carry mutations in ion channel genes that can predispose them to malignant cardiac arrhythmias and therefore SUDEP. And what we need to be looking to do is to diagnose those genetic mutations before someone dies of SUDEP. So this is where advances in whole genome genomics might be allowed us to be able to, at the start of someone's epilepsy diagnosis, do a whole genome test and find out the patients who have got a genetic epilepsy and where those genes are expressed, and whether this is one of the genes that will put them in a high risk for SUDEP. And then in those patients specifically, target mechanisms, whether it's monitors at night or by whatever mechanisms, to reduce the risk for SUDEP. So this is definitely something I think we're going to see a change in the next 5 years, 10 years, where I think everybody with newly diagnosed epilepsy will probably get genomic analysis, or certainly those that have any hint of a genetic epilepsy. And I think that won't just have benefit in terms of the understanding the epilepsy, but also in terms of stratifying the risk for SUDEP.
Okay, next question from Eugene Leong, and she's asking, from one of your studies, how many patients with SUDEP were pregnant, and molar pregnancy rare with brain secondaries? She's Professor Eugene. Yeah, she's asking this question.
So the first bit I got, that was the question, is how many people with SUDEP were pregnant? It's a really good question. In our studies, I don't think anyone, but there certainly has been a number of cases of SUDEP in pregnant women. And I've, in my practice, tragically have encountered this a few times. And the circumstance that I've normally encountered with is a woman who becomes pregnant accidentally and is petrified about the effects of the anti-epileptic drugs on their baby. And we do know that certain drugs, particularly valproate, can have adverse effects on babies in terms of malformations and neurocognitive changes. Women are not surprisingly often very scared about the effects of drugs. And I've seen a few times women that got pregnant when they didn't plan, stop their medications suddenly. I've even seen circumstances where some doctors have told you to stop their medications and then they've died of SUDEP because they've had a seizure because of coming off the medication. So in my experience, that's the most common reason why someone who is pregnant dies of SUDEP, is because they don't take their medications properly because they're worried about the effects on their baby.
Okay, I think in interest of time, we just take one last question, Terry. The young people, Bianca is asking, young people age 15 to 24 appear to be more at risk of SUDEP, and does maturation, puberty, and brain development appear to have any contribution as a risk factor to SUDEP?
Yeah, that's a good question. So why is the median age of SUDEP only 35? Why does it disproportionately affect younger people? Yeah, that's a really good question. It may be a simple answer, like younger people with epilepsy generally have more severe epilepsy. Older people with epilepsy, more often than not, the epilepsy is easier to control and better controlled. Young people more likely stop their medications, go out to parties and drink too much and do other party drugs, which can provoke seizures. So lifestyle reasons often contribute to poorer seizure control in young people. So maybe a simple relationship between young people having more seizures than older people. It is also possible that there are biological differences between young people and older people, as you've alluded to, that makes the young people more likely to have seizures. Sorry, I see that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Terence O'Brien. I think thank you for the wonderful talk and also highlighting the importance of talking about SUDEP, because I think, as you mentioned, community awareness is the key in order to prevent SUDEP related death. Thank you so much for your talk and your answering the questions.